Well, hello there. This is the 13th century Skitside Man with another video. And here we are at Old Sarum. Mainly a ruin, so let's get stuck in. As you can see, there is the toy in its native habitat on the floor in Old Sarum.
In case you are wondering, we did take Silver the Hedgehog back to lost property, and hopefully he did make his way to the rightful owner. No upset kids on my watch. Anyway, enough shenanigans from Silver. Let's get on with the video. I'll start by saying that even though the site of Old Sarum is truly ancient, harking back into prehistory, and serving as an Iron Age oppidum seen by the likes of Julius Caesar, I'm not here to go through history step by step, as I've done that already in the History of Salisbury series, episode 2 in fact. I'm here for the Norman castle that once stood on the site of this ruin, a highly important castle built by William the Conqueror after his conquest of Britain, 1069. A Moat and Bailey affair using the blueprint of the existing hill fort. And it wasn't just a castle, as there was also a cathedral here, along with a town. This was once the original Salisbury, though our concentration will be on the castle itself, upon a hill.
Oh, will you look at this? That's the old cathedral. Not the Salisbury Cathedral, the old cathedral. Now ruinous, because it was no longer needed. Thus, the newer one was built. And we'll be down there in a minute.
This plane would frequently fly by, dropping lots of chaps in parachutes. I can only assume it's a Ryionaire Flight, and they hadn't paid to land. Unfortunately, unlike the other castles we've seen, like Cardiff and Ssbury, Old Sarum is a ruin, and very little remains. We only have a vague idea of how this castle might have looked in its heyday, and, like the others, it would have certainly undergone various alterations as time went on. You first enter the castle through a sizable gatehouse, and this gets you to the Outer Bailey, currently a large expanse of grass where a small town would once have stood. Crossing the Outer Bailey, you get to the bridge that accesses the Inner Bailey Keep, which we call the main castle. It's just highly unfortunate that so little remains of it. We currently cross by a modern bridge over the old moat. Under the bridge, you can see the old moat that surrounds the hill. Good defences that could make it a bugger to assault. Though these days, you can't see them, but the dry moat is home to many rabbits who live wild here, hopping about in all the green. There are also rabbit holes to watch out for, as the buggers love digging. It can be a help though, as they often eject pieces of archaeology from their holes, things like animal bones. Much like Clifford's Tower in York, Old Sarum belonged to the crown, rather than a magnate like the others. And when the king was away, it was placed in charge of a castellan. During the Conqueror's reign, this was the High Sheriff of Wiltshire. A few sheriffs are recorded, like Philippe de Buckland, Elphus the Sheriff, and Edward of Salisbury. But the castle was also home to the Bishop of Salisbury, who, under the Conqueror, was a chap named Herman. He's the one who begins construction of the cathedral there, in the Outer Bailey, of which only the outline remains. And the cathedral itself, by the way, was most likely based on the Sainte Trinité in Caen, where his wife Matilda would one day be buried. The Conqueror's, that is, not Herman's. And by the time it was completed, Herman, the bishop there, had given way to St Osmond, who took the building all the way up to the last year of the 11th century. During this time, William the Conqueror orders the creation of his great survey, the famous Liber de Wintonia, the Book of Winchester, or, as it was later dubbed, the Domesday Book. This lengthy parchment-bound tome was most likely presented to the Conqueror here at Old Sarum in 1086, around when he met his magnates and other landowners, about 170 people, to swear fealty at the Salisbury Oath. There was also the Sarum Rite, a religious act passed here, pretty much a deviation of the Latin Rite. So already, under the Conqueror, we've got a slightly different approach to mass and other customs. Nothing significant, it's all subtle, but those in the know would know, you know? Now, during this period, say between 1070 and 1099, Edward of Salisbury ends up serving under two kings, as when the Conqueror passes away in 1087, his son, William Rufus, takes over Old Sarum. And around the turn of the century, things are about to change. For a start, King Rufus dies in a hunting accident, leaving Old Sarum to his brother, King Henry I. And, not long after, the sheriff, Edward of Salisbury, is no longer serving in that position. There's even a new bishop, Roger of Salisbury, and he's a very powerful man. Now, Roger of Salisbury isn't just a priest. He's the former Lord Chancellor and a castle builder in his own right, becoming Viceroy to King Henry I during the 1120s and 1130s. It's now the bishop who is Castellan here, and not the old sheriffs. And Roger builds a new keep with a household, a garrison, and administrative personnel. Okay, so here is a map for an idea of what's going on. You can see the old cathedral on the top left, and all the old buildings making up the Outer Bailey are now long gone. So let's turn our focus to the main castle. We've just entered via the guardhouse over there on the right, one of the oldest parts of Old Sarum, built in the first phase along with a great tower. And we're just about to approach the main keep, which also served as a bishop's palace of sorts, which is directly ahead of the old gatehouse. These days, just as ruinous as the rest of the castle. As I said, the gatehouse, along with the postern gate at the other end, are the oldest parts of this ruin, harking back to the first phase of construction. It would have boasted a portcullis and a drawbridge, and you'd have been greeted by guards. And here you can see where the guard rooms were, and one of them even had a roaring hearth. A fire much needed, as Old Sarum can get extremely windy in the autumn and winter. Actually, the staff here have to occasionally close the site down in the later months of the year. And from here, you could once access the ramparts that circled the perimeter of the castle. You can just imagine where things were. As for us, we're heading across the Inner Bailey to that ruined Bishop's Palace.
And this is the Bishop's Solar. You've already looked and you can see all the nooks and crannies where there's windows and doorways in there. So let's have a look in here. Here we are.
Unfortunately, you don't really get the scale of the building here, but it did rise up a few stories. In fact, you were actually required to access it via the second floor.
Another good spiral staircase. This one's in ruins, of course, but you can see how that would have wound up. Because this would be the kitchen area, and that would have wound upwards. This would have been high up with different stories and different floors. You can imagine it back in the day.
Of course, the spiral staircase wasn't the main way up. That's just how the staff got up into the kitchens. The nobility would have to ascend by another route to get access to the Great Hall and beyond. It was a pretty grand affair, as you could imagine, and you can just see where the fireplace was situated as things like this survive.
And all original stonework. This is beautiful. I prefer, personally, ruins like this often than some of the larger castles which are fully made. Because here you only get to the old castle. Pretty much ends around the time of Henry VIII. But the fully made castles, you get the Renaissance, you get the Enlightenment, etc., the Victorians remaking it. Here you get to see how things really were.
And I say kitchens, it may have even been a storage area for a lot of the time, as a whole tower is dedicated to kitchens elsewhere. And from here, you can get straight to the chapel. And this is the east turret, as even though this is a bishop's palace, it was still built with military defence in mind. Thus, most of the castle can only be accessed from the second floor, meaning to get there and you the enemy, you had to put up a fight. And all this was attached to the ramparts and other strategic fortifications. Old Sarum, like many others, is no pushover. Right, now here you have the chapel. A double chapel pretty much, spanning 2 floors. You have St Margaret's on ground level, and St Nicholas was situated above. This would have had a vaulted ceiling, and the altar is carved at the far end. The main palace towered above all of this, and in its heyday it must have been a magnificent sight to behold. Oh, and just outside you have the well, and apparently the water was extremely refreshing, but a right chore to lower and raise. It's around 70 metres deep. Yes, and so for any Americans out there who use anything but the metric system, it's the depth of around 230 sausage dogs. Nose to tail, that is, in a line, not standing on top of each other. Not that there's much difference in the equation. Anyway, the well is also the centre point of the courtyard in the Inner Bailey, and is a good place to chat and share gossip, especially for the laboratories classes, the servants. The Inner Bailey would have been bustling with activity at all times, and there would have been stone paths connecting the various buildings. The castle building bishop certainly knew what he was doing. There is also a second well here, near one of the walls, and some interesting archaeology has been uncovered. You see, when the Normans built this modern bailey, they created the mound you see today, which pretty much buried any evidence of the old Roman Iron Age structures. However, the well goes down, and the archaeologists began uncovering things from the Roman period. And here they found evidence of an old stone building with a paved area. Now, no one truly knows what it's for. Could be a temple, but no one would truly know unless you destroy the mound and dig up Old Sarum, or maybe in the future there's some science fiction way of doing it, but until now it's guesswork. As for pictures of all this, Buckley's chance. That's all going on elsewhere, and I am not an archaeologist. Anyway, I'm here to explore the old Norman ruins, and it's time I had a varder at the upper levels of the Bishop's Solar, so I'll cross the inner bailey and take a path that leads to it, passing some old fort buildings on the way. Now, some people will say that the Bishop's Palace isn't the one here. It's the one built near the old St Mary's Cathedral in the Outer Bailey. But not so fast, because Roger was also in charge of the castle, his castellan. Remember, he's more than just a priest. He's most likely hogging both buildings, to be fair, and the one in the Outer Bailey seems to have been built later, around the death of King Henry I. Plus, would you think someone of Roger's power isn't going to be living in the biggest building in the area? Huh. Roger of Salisbury is running the King's Exchequer from here, as well as the administration, the kingdom, and he's not going to be running all this from the church, let's be honest. His religious work is most likely taking a back seat, delegated to a dean or something. Plus, he's making huge changes to the Outer Bailey Cathedral, St Mary's, meaning it's looking like a construction site. Above the chapel are those railings. That's where the walls of the palace once stood, towering over the roof, and that's where we're headed, the second floor, the Solar, the Castellan's private residence. It's pretty much joined up with the postern and the Great Tower, following a dirt track up. Of course, back in the day, there would have been stone steps, and even in the modern age, there is a staircase nearby, but I was a pillock and didn't notice. And just think that once Roger of Salisbury lived here, there was a great hall, a great chamber, living quarters, and just about everything else. He had his own courtyard. If it wasn't for the terrible wind, no, the weather, then this place would have been quite a good standard of luxury for the 12th century, the reign of good old Henry I. You might think there is not much to see here, but you can make out where things were and their function. Like ahead, on our side of the railings, are seen the ruins of the hall, where the nobility sat to feast, with Roger of Salisbury sat at the high table, entertaining his guests. And if you want to go, it's not too far to go.
Now, if you want to do your proper in the castle, here is the guardrobe. And you're going to need a gong cleaner because it's the long drop and a sudden plop method. There's no flushable lavatory here.
Though, unlike the other castles I covered, there is no river or moat below. It's a sheer pit, meaning this place must have stank at times, and some poor sod, the gong cleaner, would have been lowered down here with a shovel. But hey, he got to keep whatever he found, and you'd be surprised by what the nobility leave behind down in the lavatory. Aside from the obvious.
You wouldn't believe this, but while this place was being excavated, a ring was found down there. An expensive one. An emerald one. So, makes you wonder how it got there.
Living here, with all these feasts and banquets, it must have been quite the life. Though there were growing tensions between the clergy at Old Sarum and the king's garrison there. Petty squabbles that would see Roger of Salisbury leave the palace here and build another adjacent to the old cathedral in the Outer Bailey. You've got tales of the bishops heading to cathedral to preach the sermon, only to get locked out of the castle for hours. You've got monks being accused of debauchery. You've got the priests not being allowed access to the well. There's all kinds of shenanigans. Roger of Salisbury would one day fall from grace. He had far too much power, and the king at the time, King Stephen, plotted to rein him in. Besides, this was the time leading up to the anarchy, and before switching allegiance, the bishop had supported Matilda. The anarchy had broken out about 1138, and Stephen doesn't trust Roger. In a bid to strip him of his castles, the king summons the bishop to court. Roger responds by arriving with a contingent of troops, as does the king, assuming he's going to be assassinated. The two men planned to discuss things sensibly, allegedly, but the troops had other ideas, and after an argument over living quarters, a melee broke out. Without hesitation, King Stephen has Roger of Salisbury arrested and his castles placed under siege. The bishop himself was simply slung in prison, and he'll die there of starvation in 1139, either deliberately by the guards, or maybe on Stephen's order, or due to hunger strike, because he's also protesting his son being under siege at nearby Devizes Castle. When they ransacked Roger's solar, the garrison found many artifacts from the cathedral that had been stolen by the bishop. He had amassed quite the collection. What a scallywag. So, in 1139, the bishopric is up for grabs, and there would be arguments between king and clergy, and this would last for years. We get more of the shenanigans from earlier. And during the anarchy, Old Sarum sort of fell into disrepair, and the Castellan was once again the Sheriff of Wiltshire, probably a man named Warren or William, is unclear. What we do know is that Patrick of Salisbury is constable here during the 1140s. Now, Patrick is quite an important figure during this time, supporting King Stephen. He's a rising star, and he'll boost his prestige by marrying his sister Sybil. No, not in that way. He marries her to John Fitzgilbert, a low-ranking knight. In a nutshell, Fitzgilbert had switched allegiance to Matilda when Stephen was captured in the Battle of Lincoln. He later helped Matilda escape as the war went back and forth. He'd also quarrelled with Patrick, but this marriage brought an alliance between the two families. It made the king happy, who made Patrick an earl, the Earl of Salisbury. And Patrick is even minting his own coins here. The baronial issues.
Hey! I can see the pub from there!
After the anarchy, Henry II, the son of Matilda, inherited the throne, and his queen was the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Patrick of Salisbury would run Old Sarum in his absence, and away from the clergy who had now been long banished to the palace in the Outer Bailey, run by Bishop Jocelyn, who oversees the old cathedral. And the shenanigans will continue, only getting worse. Going back to the royals though, the Great Tower here was probably built for the king when he stayed on his visits, which were more common than not. This was one of the oldest parts of the castle, built around the time of the gatehouse. The Great Tower has everything, with a huge feasting hall, multiple chambers, and most likely a private chapel for when the king stayed here. And Henry II planned on pushing this castle into a new era, the Angevin era. He expanded the palace considerably, adding a dressing room and treasury and other parts. A sizable building that you accessed by the stone stairs you see here, and no doubt leading to a great hall, one that no longer exists. And adjoining the great hall is the postern gate that guards the rear entrance to the castle.
Well, welcome to the dungeon.
Yes, you heard me right. Dungeon. Though it wasn't the open-air affair you see here. And it also lacks a dragon.
And if you look closer, you will see a note.
Dungeon. The word has changed dramatically over the years. Back in the day, this whole building was a dungeon, because it comes from the French word donjon, which means castle keep.
Whack a couple of beds in. Bit of carpet. Yeah. Could live here.
Someone did.
Yes. So yeah.
Once upon a time, this was fit for a king.
And do take in mind, this wasn't all there was to the keep, because there's a whole load of stories that aren't visible nowadays, that are in roofs up and up. So, looking all over the whole area. Again, look at that view. Yeah.
But as for Patrick, he was also High Sheriff of Wiltshire until around 1159, where there is a succession of short-lived sheriffs after, but Patrick remains here at Old Sarum with a household of over 50 knights, the Salisbury Menhirs. One of the knights of this retinue was the young William Fitzjohn, fresh from the tournament circuit in Normandy. He is the son of John Fitzgilbert, Patrick's brother-in-law, person that married Sybil earlier. We know William Fitzjohn by another name, as the legendary William Marshal, due to the family's long history as serving as the King's Marshal. And for a couple of years, Patrick was mentor to this young knight, intent on advancing his career. But in 1168, there was trouble brewing in the lands of Aquitaine. Trouble the king could not ignore. brothers from the Lusignan household in neighbouring Poitou were causing havoc. Geoffrey and Guy, they were looting and pillaging villages and farmsteads. Awful things. King Henry had to quell this, and an expedition was mobilised to deal with it. Patrick of Salisbury would accompany this army as it crossed the Channel and into the continental lands. More, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine would accompany them. After all, these were her lands. But when they arrived in Aquitaine, King Henry's men fell upon the Lusignans, utterly crushing them. They also destroyed their horses, which rendered the Lusignans impotent in their ability to raise battle. But they were still not totally defeated, as their main lands are in Poitou. And Henry planned on going there. Once Aquitaine was settled, King Henry gathered his army and pushed his forces north to crush the Lusignans at Poitou, but not before installing Queen Eleanor as the commander of her Aquitaine province at the capital of Poitiers, and Patrick of Salisbury was to be her lieutenant. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Right, the expedition heads to Poitiers, the capital of Aquitaine. It was unarmoured save for a few knights, and Patrick was in the lead. Young William Marshal was charged with protecting the Queen's cortege, the entourage. Then the ambush struck. Men from the household of Guy de Lusignan fell upon the Queen's retinue, coming from the rear and without mercy. The Salisbury Minier, mostly without armour, desperately tried to hold the road from the onslaught. If they failed, the Queen could be captured or killed. As the melee raged, some held the line and others tried hurriedly to don armour. Now Patrick, some say the Marshal, took the Queen aside and forced her on a horse, sending her at haste to the castle at Poitiers, riding like the wind while they held the road. And this they did. After an initial clash, Patrick regrouped, mounting his destrier and grabbing lance and shield, turning around and throwing himself back into the fray. Only he was isolated, as were many others. Now he was caught by a lance by Lusignan knight and slain without mercy. In an age of chivalry and ransoms, where nobility were captured not killed, especially an earl, this was an outrage. In later years, this would come with an accusation of the deliberate assassination of an English earl. The battle raged on. By now, William Marshal and some of the Salisbury Minier had donned armour, defending the road to the last, making sure Queen Eleanor was safely at a distance. She was. The Queen was safe. And Patrick's forces, what was left of them, had either fled or been captured. All but the Marshal. William's horse had fallen beneath him, but still he fought on foot, sword in hand, and taking many wounds, but many fell beneath him, fighting his last stand, encircled and his back to a hedge, like a boar fighting a pack of wolves. Before finally getting dragged down and captured. Now the ransom start. But his heroics caught the eye of Queen Eleanor, who not only paid his ransom, but gave him a position at court and the royal household as the protector of Henry, the heir apparent, soon to be crowned the young king. At Old Sarum, though, the title Earl of Salisbury would pass to Patrick's son, William of Salisbury. And now the political situation with Henry II and his sons deteriorated heavily as his reign progressed. And in 1173, the heir apparent, Henry the young king, had risen up in open revolt against his father. And it wasn't just Henry, but the older king's other sons too, all but John. More importantly, his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, also supported this rebellion, practically leading it. For Henry II, once he'd crushed this rebellion, which he did, he limited the power of his sons and threw his wife in prison. Well, more house arrest. She's hardly locked up in a tower. She's still living the life of luxury, even though he pretty much gave her just a bit of bread before slinging her to either Old Sarum or Winchester. She's imprisoned for 16 years, being moved from castle to castle. Sometimes Sarum, sometimes Winchester, sometimes others. All to prevent her gaining support and resistance against her husband, Henry II. And a good chunk of this imprisonment was spent at Old Sarum. She had her own private chapel, and she was allowed to roam the grounds, being very friendly and popular with the guards and the castellan, as she was ordering goods from abroad, including walnuts. Still, Sarum was a bleak and inhospitable place, despite all the luxuries. It's windswept and cold. Peter of Blois, a clergyman, once described it as barren, dry, and exposed to the rage of the wind. The cathedral, a captive on a hill, like the Ark of God in the profane house of Baal. Damn it. And the cathedral was frequently damaged by gale-force winds. Meanwhile, the Earl there, William, had a daughter, Ella of Salisbury. And she'll end up marrying the illegitimate son of Henry II, William Longspee, a knight. Right. In 1183, at Old Sarum, Queen Eleanor would hear some terrible news. Her eldest son and heir to the throne, Henry the young king, had died tragically while on a military campaign in the continent. The Archdeacon of Kent, Thomas Agnell, was charged with delivering the bad news, but apparently he found her calm and well, as much as she can put it on, as she was already prepared for the news. Eleanor claimed to have seen it in a dream, her son laying in state with a sapphire ring. 5 years later, Eleanor would see her estranged husband, Henry, in the summer of 1188, when he visited her in Sarum, before setting out for yet another war against France. He would not return, passing away Chinon in Normandy, because a lot was going on. His sons were once again in full rebellion, only this time they were older. This time they were far more experienced, and this time they were led by Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, and the youngest son, John, who'd also joined the rebellion. And that's the final straw. Exhausted and ill, the king was dead. Now William Marshal once again enters the story, but not at Old Sarum but Winchester, as Richard the Lionheart demands his mother is set free, and the Marshal is dispatched to deliver the good news. Only she's not there. She's already decided to free herself and legged it. Good. Now, under the reign of King Richard, which goes on from 1189 until the end of the 12th century, William of Salisbury controls Old Sarum, even becoming sheriff for a year at one point. Other sheriffs then come and go as the decade rolled on. And during this time, Hubert Walter is bishop here, before getting promoted to Canterbury. Now, the main figures we are seeing around this time are Herbert Poor, as Bishop of Salisbury, and his brother Richard, who is the Bishop of Durham, are both the pretty powerful men. Right. Also, already by this time, the idea is proposed to relocate the cathedral to a space nearby, as the relationship between the clergy and the military is getting to a head, and the weather conditions are terrible, as we know. It's really not a good castle to live in. Unfortunately, this proposal never gets the proverbial green light, and they have to remain here, the clergy this is. In 1196, William of Salisbury passes away, and the earldom, along with Old Sarum, is inherited by Countess Ella and her husband William Longsby. 3 years later, the crown would also pass down from Richard the Lionheart to the infamous King John. During this period, it was most likely King John who built a new hall along the south wall, not too far from the Great Tower. There's also a bakehouse, which you will no doubt have noticed in the footage shown earlier, and I'm showing it again now for good measure. Anyway, William Longsby, by the way, would also become sheriff here, hogging the position for 10 years, right through the First Barons' War, where pretty much everyone rebelled against King John, except Longspee, who remained loyal with a few others, like William Marshal. His finest hour was defeating the French fleet at the Battle of the Dam, the largest naval victory in the medieval era. Well, for the English anyway. William Longsby also served through the signing of the Magna Carta, and when King John died of dysentery and the crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Longsby led the Salisbury Minier, who once again fought alongside the elderly William Marshal, to drive the invading French from the land, crushing them at the Battle of Lincoln. He also oversaw the final split between church and military during the early reign of Henry III, where Richard Poor, the current Bishop of Salisbury, picked up his toys and took them home, buggering off to found a new city, the modern-day Salisbury. Get him! The old cathedral was pretty much taken down, and a new Gothic one built not too far away. That's the St Mary's we know and love today. As for Old Sarum, now it really hits a decline, pretty much just a military garrison on a hill. The town in the Outer Bailey was pretty much relocated to the new construction site across the hill, the new city of Salisbury. William Longsby will accompany King Henry III on campaign, a failed expedition to win back the Norman lands lost by John. And here, Longsby ends up getting shipwrecked, lost, presumed dead. Then the justiciar, Hubert de Burgh, tries to seduce the widow, Countess Ella, only she's not a widow, because Longsby lives to return, and then die a few months later. Typical. Now Ella is Countess on her own. And like the others, Ella becomes Sheriff of Wiltshire on 3 different occasions. She's actually quite good at the job. But the site of Old Sarum is mostly derelict after Ella passes from this world. The town in the Old Bailey is long gone. People are now living in a thriving city nearby, and the castle limps its way into the 14th century. The title of Earl, Countess, passes from Margaret to Alice, and then in 1322 King Edward II orders its deconstruction, and the title of Earl is forfeited, Alice being the last. Thus ends the story of Old Sarum. But I hear you say, you mentioned Henry VIII earlier. Henry VIII, you know, the king who loves fractions and wives. Well, the castle was mostly still here, what's left of it. And in the 16th century, King Henry VIII sells the stones to Thomas Compton, and Compton makes the city walls around the cathedral close. So there you go. Now the story of Old Sarum truly ends in the 16th century, thus becoming the domain of archaeologists, historians and the public alike. Now it's in the hands of the English heritage, where it remains to this day, and anyone can visit. Oh, and I contacted the staff at Old Sarum itself to inquire about Silver the Hedgehog, to see if it got collected or is still lost. And apparently it's not in lost property. It's not there. So it looks like the owners collected it after all. Happy days.
All original. Stone.
Thank you for watching.